there's already a lot of strengths that SMCT have to implement the GIA process. The GIA process is being asked of public sector entities by the Victorian government due to the implementation of the Gender Equality Act. And I know that there is a project underway for what that means internally, all right, called a Gender Equality Action Plan, and you have submitted your workplace gender audit. Now, someone referred to how this can work with my people internally. Whilst this is a deliberate external ask, so a GIA is asking you to look externally, right? It will have an effect on how you work with your people to do that. But if you're already doing those things that you already suggested, which is consultation, etc., it's my perspective is it's the biggest thing you're going to need to do is to raise their awareness about gender equality. And the biggest thing and the starting point to do that is to say, why does it matter? It matters on a global scale. This is SDG 5 from the United Nations Development Goals, which I know you're all aware of. But what they absolutely know is that creating equality and ending discrimination, recognising the value of care and domestic work, participation in leadership, universal access, what we actually know is that these things are a fundamental human right. If you look at this sentence, I want you to replace the word world with SMCT. So it'd say, gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous and sustainable Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust. That's actually the why, and the evidence of it is pretty clear. This is, I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? Do you want me to expand it a bit? This is actually a scorecard from the World Economic Forum of the latest global gender gap, right? This is where Australia is, and hopefully you can see where I've highlighted. We're really good at educating everyone. Not really. There's still a significant part of Australia's population that needs to be educated more. But from a gender perspective, what you can see is that lower highlight says that we're pretty good at educating men and women, or all genders, right? But what happens is our participation rate in the workforce and in the economy and society drops. And over the last few years, what's actually happened is that Australia has dropped from being quite high globally in equality to now where we are, which is 50th in the world. Quite significant. So the reason we say this is important is actually because at the end of the day, it actually creates to better economic, better productivity, but also better social and community cohesion. And we know that really at the moment because of the pandemic. The pandemic has not caused inequality, it's actually revealed it, right? Now there's some statistics and data about what it has actually revealed from an equality perspective. I want to acknowledge that this is looking at gender in a binary, so men and women, but what we know more and more, that's my grandfather clock. But what we know now is that the gender is a spectrum, that it's more than binary. So just forgive me that I'm going to talk to that for the moment. There's some statistics there about the decline in workforce participation, the increase in mental health. We've got some local government areas at the moment that are reporting 60% of women have anxiety and depression rates. We've got high levels of displacement for the workforce of women because what we know is that they had to choose between care and paid work. We also know that there is increasing realisation of the taking up of unpaid work, and the Hilda data that came out yesterday said that. But we also know, because it's writ large a little bit at the moment, about the reality of more gender diversity in a workplace and in decision making as well. So that's one of the reasons why having a intersectional gender lens on the products and the services that we deliver is important. It creates greater levels of alignment between what we do and what the community is. It actually creates a better sense of cohesion. And we know from the evidence is that if we get a diversity and more women involved in decision making about, in your case, how they want to memorialise their loved ones in the community, that will create better services that are more in keeping with the needs of community as well. So that's the why. Lula, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, or Vida as well, about the why it's important to think about through this GIA process or policy from the point of view of equity in the community?
I'll just add that the process we're going to go through will start to identify the places in your systems and structures that you can create more gender equal benefits and outcomes. So it's not just about participation, but we really are looking at excuse me, how the work that SMCT does generates through multiple avenues more gender equal outcomes. So that can start to touch on who your suppliers are and that sort of work as well. It's not only the end result of having accessibility, but more generalised outcomes across the economic benefits of the work of SMCT as well.
Yeah.
From my perspective, Kit,
yes.
Our vision is to, support our community to honour and celebrate life in the way that they choose. And so being very deliberate in the questions and the services and programs that we're offering to our community, we can ensure that there's further inclusion along each step of that process for them. And that's a critical piece for us as an organisation.
Yep, wonderful. So the way that we address this, the way that we achieve the outcomes that we hope for our organisation, is we need to actually take deliberate steps. And the Act actually asks public entities to take special measures to address systemic and structural inequity. And for that, it actually needs to be transformational. I'm going to hand over to Lula in just a second to take us through the next part. But what I'd like to ask you to do, if I may, is we're just going to ask you to go on to just let us know that from your perspective, what is gender equality look like for SMCT? I mean, this can mean many things to many people depending upon your lived experience. I mean, I think, Julie, working with diverse communities, you know that there are different perspectives of that in community and what that means. But if you were going to describe what gender equality means at SMCT, what would that look like? Here we go. Hopefully coming up now. Voices. I think that feedback, that reflects the feedback, I think, that came through before about what you already do. That gender doesn't impact on rights, access and service, and making sure how do we do that. All equal voices, material opportunity to contribute. These are incredible statements, and Vida, certainly something that if we write a policy, if there's a policy development, these can be actually intent pieces that we put in there. I think what's really important, and I'm going to hand over to Lula now, is around this recognition that it's about equity of access, contributing equally, balance and fair representation. And Lula, I think where we need to start is thinking about, well, what stops that, I guess? What stops that? So I might hand over to you now, Lula, to take through what we mean by transformation and what stops it happening. Stuff.
Thanks, Kit. So as Kit sort of touched on before, we are trying to do gender transformational work in the way that we apply the analysis and understanding through gender impact assessments. So the work that we need to, sorry, I have cats running around like maniacs right now under the desk. So what we need to do the transformational piece is currently understand the constraints and what we're working with. And when we do that, we're really talking about the gender binary, and that's the place that we need to start and get a really good grip on that so that we can see it, understand it, recognize where it is influencing our thoughts and our opinions and our actions that then impact the outcomes. And so we're going to take you through a couple of slides and understand potentially some exercises around understanding how our own selves and our own lives and the work we do is influenced by this. So first of all, I'll just unpack the binary a little bit, and the construct of the binary. First of all, it is a construct. And so when we talk about it, we're not saying that there are only masculine and feminine, but we're discussing why we need to understand that. So the gender binary obviously then doesn't exclude people who are well, it does exclude people who are non-binary, and that's part of the issue. But we want to talk about how rigid adherence to the gender binary and stereotypes really is promoting a sense of conformity and hierarchy that creates exclusion and discrimination. So as we can see on the screen in front of us, we start to unpack some of the issues around it. So we've got the binary of the masculine and feminine qualities, and that's the distinction of gender into two opposite forms of masculine and feminine, and that's whether by social system or cultural belief, every society, ethnic group and culture has gender role expectations that we put onto that. And they can be different from group to group, but they can also change within the same society over time. So in a binary model, you're expected to perform your gender expression and your sexuality may be assumed to define, to align by default to one's aspects that are linked to your sex or one's genetic or gamete-based sex and as identified at birth. So for example, when a male is born, in gender binarism may assume that a male will be masculine in appearance, have masculine character traits, behaviours, and include having a heterosexual attraction to females. So these aspects start to break into things about the way we behave, the way we dress, sexual orientation, our names, pronouns, and other qualities. And these expectations may reinforce negative attitudes, bias, and discrimination towards people who display expressions of gender variance or nonconformity, or whose identity is different to their birth sex. And you start to see that when we talk about ideas about the man box and how that's policed, and how we can actually see the different ways in our own lives and experience of others, how as a society we actually create this limitation of what we expect someone can or could or should be related to their gender role. And it's policed quite heavily. And we can go through that in a bit if we want to. The other thing to understand is this work, when we're talking about exploring the binary and doing transformational work, is not at all to say that you can't find a sense of strength and belonging and comfort in your gender and your gender expression. We've all been socialised by the gender binary, and all of us have those expectations and assumptions around that. And it's not bad in and of itself to have concepts of masculine and feminine, but what it is tricky when we start to understand that the way it's been constructed means that feminine is subordinate to masculine, and how that's replicated throughout our system structures, the way we value work, the way we value people, who gets to speak in public, etc., etc. And so we'll move on, I think, to our stereotypes next. So we've got the binary, and then associated with the binary are the 4 gender stereotypes. And as you can see, these then define your personality traits, domestic behaviours, physical appearance and occupation. So for example, personality traits, we know that women are often expected to be accommodating and to be emotional, while men are usually expected to be self-confident and aggressive. Domestic behaviours, well, we know women do something like 20-something hours a week of domestic labour, and men only doing 10 at the moment, and the roles are very much defined as feminine roles are inside the house and domesticated, whereas masculine roles are outside the house and they're leadership roles, and that sort of thing. Occupations, physical appearance, a lot of pressure put on women to be physically attractive, to attract a male partner. So again, that heteronormativity put into that space of the binary, and very much we're weighed up about our value really being reduced to whether we are attractive enough as a mate, as a partner, will we be sexually appealing and sexually available to a male partner to pick us off the shelf and decide that we are worthy of their time and attention, and that maybe they'll benefit us with bestowing us with their access to their resources and protection. And then we've got occupations. And so that's obviously, again, in your work, it's already been identified. Go let the cabinet maker in, and we're going to guess their gender. Because we're talking about occupations. And so you can see this gender segregated workforce. You know, we know that there are occupations that are predominantly masculine, such as construction, engineering, that sort of thing. And we know that, and politics and the like. And we know there are other industries that are particularly female dominant, such as caring, childcare, nursing, retail, and often that aligns with more insecure and lower paid work as well. So,
do you want to go to the maybe people can give some feedback about a stereotype that they've seen recently?
Or one that you've experienced in your life?
I was talking the other day, Lila, to my mother about some of the stuff that's going on, you know, nationally, and how my now past or dead, deceased grandmothers would see it now, that they would look, we think that they would be very proud of the women standing up for inappropriate behaviours, but also the men that were supporting it as well. You know, this is women that couldn't have their own bank account, couldn't take out a home loan, so things have changed, but there's still those stereotypes that exist today. That we all experience. Yeah, so that's an example, isn't it, there, of that occupational stereotype.
And the expectation that motherhood will mean that you need the flexibility to care for children in a way that a father doesn't.
Yeah.
School uniform, yeah, totally. Yep, skirts, culottes. No pants for the girls.
My daughter's 14 and she's noticed that she can't wear her hair down, which is a little bit here, but the young men that wear mullets can.
Interesting.
Yeah.
They haven't adapted to the mullet style.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, the young men can't wear their hair long if they want to as well. They're told to cut it as well.
Yeah, and boys aren't allowed to wear skirts.
Yep. Who would be expected to work an outdoors role? Absolutely, yeah. But similarly, men being, you know, that occupational care roles, you know, childcare workers, equally segregated industry as trades, I think, as well.
Even small things like who takes out the rubbish?
Yeah.
Who cleans the gutters?
Yep.
Who mows the lawn?
Yep. The other interesting thing is when you get personality traits when people act against their stereotype, isn't it? So if you get a woman that perhaps is assertive, she can be called bossy. Sometimes men, if they act with care, are labelled sissy or weak, aren't they? So how those personality traits, we police them, don't we?
Yeah, don't throw like a girl. You run like a girl.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Both partners working, but only one cooks. Excellent.
Oh my gosh, we did an exercise with women counsellors early this year. There's a whole raft of new female counsellors across Victoria, and the amount of questions they have been asked about, but who's going to cook dinner for you, your husband or your children now that you're a counsellor?
Yeah.
It was revealing.
It was revealing. They're really great examples. Really great examples. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so we can see how, you know, we're sitting here talking about words and concepts like binary and gender stereotypes, but, you know, we can actually see how this is very real as the way it impacts our lives on a day-to-day basis. Like it's not separate from my life, from your life. It's not this, oh, gender equality is this thing that happens over there and we've got to look at it as this sort of external thing. It's something that we all inhabit and that we all have choices that we make, or things that are projected onto us based on our gender role. And that's, you know, continues to function particularly in the workplace. So the work that we're going to be asking you to do when you're applying a gender lens really to the gender impact assessment is we're doing twofold. So there's a part of sitting in the reality that we've all been socialised by gender norms. We've all understood that there are gender roles and expectations about who does what based on the body that you inhabit and the gender role that's projected onto you for that. And so there's two steps. In a gender lens, we need to make sure that we're being inclusive and that we're not putting up false barriers that exclude particularly women from the opportunities, access and benefits that you provide SMCT, both for the community-based work that you do, but the business side of the work that you do as well. And so when we're talking about that element of inclusivity and making sure we don't have things that exclude, we've got the practical gender lens, and that's making sure we meet the needs of what is currently existing in people's lives, but it doesn't challenge the gender division of labour or gender roles. So an example of that may be that you create times to engage women around school hours so that you can access them. Brilliant, because you know that they have different demands on their time than potentially male breadwinner who's not doing the same amount of work in the home. Or it might be you create breastfeeding spaces for people who are accessing your services on site. So they're the kind of things that identify a practical gender lens, and the lighting around safety, all that sort of stuff that you'll be thinking about. So it's kind of the reality of what is, if we're looking at the day-to-day lived experience of people in their gender roles. And then the step that the Gender Equality Act is really wanting you to think about and achieve is this next bit, the strategic gender needs. And that means that when we become aware of how our work is being influenced by gender roles that continue to perpetuate the subordinate of feminine roles to masculine roles, that we do something meaningful about that, that we don't just sit back and go, oh, well, that's how it is. And we actually go, well, how can we change that? What can we do? So, you know, I think this will be a considerable piece of work that you might want to think about, particularly in the space of your engineers and your construction and your suppliers. So that's a very masculine dominated area, but it's not only men who work in there. And so you might have a policy that you put over your suppliers that you try to, wherever possible, make sure that you're sourcing gender balanced suppliers. And there's a raft of services out there that can help you do that across the board, but you can look for organisations that are female-friendly workplaces, that have female representation in their executive, in their boards, and your supply chains, to make sure that that's really building in that strategic gender need part, where you're taking the access to resources, the opportunities to get that work, and you're pushing that out in a deliberate way to make sure that has a more gender balanced outcome. And that is a really meaningful thing that I think SMCT can take on board for this work, for doing a gender impact assessment.
Great. Any questions at this point before we move on? Michelle's asked a company introducing plans that they can provide which certifies them as gender equitable. I think the only one, there's no certification that we're aware of, but what organisations do nationally is that they are part of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency's reporting and regular reporting scheme. And in Victoria, of course, all of the GIA's progress reports are all going to be published through the Commission's website. So they're the two that we know of. I think that's the only two at this stage.
There's also, I mean, those ones capture the large employers, certainly. they probably don't capture a lot of your suppliers per se, but there are other, and we can get back to you. I know there's a couple of organisations that do that kind of certification process for workplaces of choice. I guess they're more about what's in place where they might seek female talent and attract that to their workplaces, and they have a list as well, so we can share that later. I just can't remember the exact name.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to ask, just because by nature of events we do use a lot of suppliers and they vary all of the time.
That's right.
And it, you know, it's become a thing now where you can go, do you have safe work practices in place, or you know, are you employing fairly in terms of wages? Are you a sustainable organisation? But I don't know if there's anything there around gender, so that we can make like, you know, you go to the shops and you're like, I can see Heart Foundation tick, for an example. I know that's not the perfect example, but just to say there are ways that you can like check the choices that you're making and make better informed choices. So I just wanted to find out how to actually find out that information before you select, because it could become a part of your selection process when you're vetting your vendors.
There's a service called Elect, which does exactly that. So it's creating gender balance through a digital marketplace, connecting entrepreneurs with government and buyers. So they start to look at that stuff. I'll just flick you that. So it's shopping by diversity, essentially.
Yeah. But I think some of the procurement practices that the government is certainly trying to improve through the Act are going to be there. But broadly, that's not a systemic approach at the moment, but still change to go. I might keep moving on if that's okay though, Michelle. Let's just remind ourselves though, the Act actually requires public entities to take deliberate action to promote and facilitate equality and create human rights and eliminate systemic gender equality. It does that by getting people, as I said, to do these 4 things: an audit, an equality action plan against 7 indicators, an impact assessment, and also report. But of course, today we're going to be focusing on the gender impact assessments. So what are they? Look, it's what's on the label. All right. So when it says gender, it's actually looking at intersectional across all genders. So, you know, those strengths that you've got around seeing what community wants, we're going to activate that part of your brain to notice things around intersectional gender equality. So intersectionality is the idea that it's not just gender that compounds disadvantage, that there are other conditions. And certainly I go again to you, Julie, you're encountering that absolutely. But it's not only culture or language, it's education level, access to SES level, socioeconomic level, a whole range of things. So that's what a GIA is asking you to do, is to look at intersectional gender equality or genders. The impact assessment is both prospective and evaluative. So it's asking you to analyse forward what might be the impact of the intervention that we're about to do, but then has it worked? So it's what it says on the label, an impact gender assessment, intersectional across all genders. Is it going to work? Will it actually make a difference? But then evaluate what you've done. This obligation actually came into effect on the 31st of March. It's one of those funny things. We're meant to be doing it now, but we need to report on it by, sorry, the 31st of October. That should be 2023. Malcolm, you had a question.
Yeah, I think specific to maybe some of our communities, have there any experience or guidance around if you take a gender equality engagement step with a community who are very far from gender equal?
Yeah.
Clearly the backlash, particularly if you're going it alone, could be as much of a problem as trying to improve things.
Yeah.
And so I think that maybe working with other groups and possibly councils and other ways to raise this conversation, particularly in communities where it's more severe than others, perhaps, is something that we've got to step into, but has its own risks. So I guess experience and how one might go about doing that.
I think your point that you're making is right, because at this point that's where people go to. They go, oh, hang on, how this is going to work across all communities. The Act is asking you to do these 3 things. It's actually asking you to engage in a process that will hopefully lead to that transformational strategic change. Now, WHISE works with communities where the word gender is not something, if we actually mention that gender equality in a space, it will break rapport. But we still, where we do it is in prevention of violence against women, but we still want to hold the community, our society to account to change their behaviours. So we do it in different ways, right? So your radar and your knowledge about that, Malcolm, and what you're radaring that your staff understands is right, but it's about holding and still holding the right behaviours to account. So the process actually asks us to do these three things. It actually asks you to assess the effect of a policy or program has on different genders. It asks you to explain how the policy or programs will be changed to promote and create gender equality. And it asks you to apply intersectional approach about the compounding forms of disadvantage. And that's the space where you can kind of, because it actually asks you to look at options. So Malcolm, that I think that you identify in the staff, that's where some of the options of the risks can come into, will this, will this create disruption too much? Will it actually allow us to promote gender equality, etc.? But it's long-term work that you're doing. So hopefully that's given you the space to understand that this is absolutely change work.
If I might just...
Yeah, please.
Just also acknowledge that, the work that you're being asked to do is social change work. And whenever you do social change, you meet resistance and backlash, absolutely. And that's part of it. And we can work with you to support you on some strategies around that as well. And it is real and it does make people uncomfortable. And that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to make the people who are trying to be on the side of social change feel uncomfortable, feel vulnerable, feel like this is too hard to do, because it's trying to maintain that status quo. And I understand that can be hard to figure out how to work with and how to challenge appropriately, when not to challenge if it is dangerous. But yeah, we can certainly help if you're finding that's something you encounter, which I expect you really will, in small and big ways, hopefully more on the small end, but even inaction can be a form of resistance. So people who just don't think it matters, it doesn't apply to them, it's not in their job to do. So we can certainly work with SMCT around some of that stuff on resistance and backlash. There's people who've gone before us, they've passed on the tricks of the trade, and we can support that for you if it's something that you're encountering or that you would like to get a little bit of a grasp on before you go out and start having these conversations or asking these questions.
Yep. Thanks, Lula. I've just put in the chat a link to a website. Now, everything we're about to talk through now is actually taken and distilled from the Commission for Gender Equality in the Public Sector's advice and process, all right? There are no state secrets here in terms of content. The grunt work, in our experience, occurs through two things: the application, and from what I call, you turn your intersectional gender lens vision on, right? So one of the things that's often, I think, the hardest thing to do is to turn this part of your reticular activating system, your brain on, that's actually become quite used to the world of the binary that Lula talked about taking almost process steps rather than strategic steps for change, all right? So just keep that in the back of your mind. Remember those stereotypes you started to think about. The first step in the process, and I want to acknowledge that the time is running short, and I appreciate that. The first thing, we'll record this, but the first thing I want to do is talk to you about, the first thing that we think about is, do I need to do a gender impact assessment? Now, the Commission's pretty clear on this. You do, all processes and policies and programs need to have a gender impact assessment done on them, only if they are new, are they being reviewed, but also if they follow this criteria. Do they directly impact on the public? There will be some things that you are talking about today that don't impact on the public, right? Are they significant? No worries, Tamina. Are they significant? what is their reach? What is their depth? Do they impact health, well-being, the economy and the community? And for many of you who are here today, certainly Lee, your centre absolutely does. Julie, the complaints policies that you look after and programs do. I think Chris and Andrew, there is no doubt the infrastructure that you are planning, the parks, absolutely do. So yeah, these sort of things do, but remember it's the policies, programs and services. The third test is why not? And the third test is there to say, well, it might not be a huge reach or it might be not completely direct, but the test is, well, why not do it anyway? Is it still a good thing to do? And that's really putting the position back, no worries, Michelle, back on you, that you can still do it. Don't eliminate itself because it's still a good thing to do. So that's the first step. Is it something that you need to actually do? No worries, Malcolm. The 4 steps here, though, that we're going to work through, this is how you do it. And if you've already got in your mind that experience of working through engaging with community, I'm actually thinking that some of these steps are probably not going to be significantly different to what you already do. The first thing we do is, what's the challenge that we're trying to address? What are the assumptions we're trying to challenge ourselves to do? Then we go through and understand the context of the policy and the service, so the environment that we're in. You do an options analysis with risks and you make a case for change. Now, I'm imagining that in the sort of work that you do, even in terms of business as usual, that they are the sort of the typical stages that you're engaged in. But what we're finding, as I said before, we're doing this for that intersectional gender equity lens. The first step that we need to do, as I said, was we define the issues and we challenge the assumptions. So what's the challenge that we're trying to address? Do we actually know what we're trying to do? How does gender impact the programs and services that we're delivering? Now, that's probably the first stage where we start to actually challenge ourselves in terms of understanding the limits of our understanding. Have we actually thought about how gender impacts what we do? So Leah, I might go to the centre that you're doing now. My understanding is that there's a lot of the women that are engaged in that. You know, an interesting question might be, how do we actually ensure that we're supporting grief for all genders in our community? That's a very liberating idea to think about. And actually, what are we trying to address? Is it supporting grief? Is it actually getting people more connected to the site and get them to understand what the trust does? So those are the sort of things as well. I don't, Lee, you put yourself off mute. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment there.
Yeah, I was just going to totally agree with you that that's definitely something that we're looking at for the programs we have.
Yeah, yeah. Again, do we understand the need for the service and the program? Again, chunking it up. But what blind spots do we have in our information gathering? So it might be you've got a consultation, but you realise when you look at the data and who actually provides input to that, that mainly we're getting feedback from women, or mainly we're getting feedback from men on this, or maybe the feedback comes from suppliers that are predominantly from male trade. So it's about actually assessing the assumptions that we have about our process from the point of view of intersectional gender equality. Do we actually get feedback from people with diversity of education experience, from diversity of language, etc.? Now, you've already got those systems in place, so it might be about strengthening them as well. Let's have a look at an example to try to encourage us to think about this a bit more practically. Now, I'm happy to share this with you through the chat, but I'm not sure everyone has got access to Google Docs. But this is a policy that's in development, Vida. Do you want to just quickly outline, Vida, what the policy does? Oh, you're on mute, mate. You're on mute, thanks.
Oh gosh, my machine just would not take me off mute then. It clearly thought I didn't have anything much important to say. This is not actually a policy at the moment. This is a process that we run through.
Yeah.
The intent of this particular program of work is to ensure that we can support our community and ourselves to choose names that are appropriate for community and our use. So when a community comes to us and wants to create an area, or we are naming a new space within the organisation as well, we try and apply some of these rules to ensure that there is an appropriate name that's created that supports both their needs, the community's needs, and cultural or religious practices and things, but also doesn't get lost or confused with any other things that we already have in our systems, that we're not trying to name it after somebody who may be inappropriate in future, and that we're not contradicting or creating confusing names of things across our sites.
Yeah. So this, if we go back to those questions, it's very clear about, I think, to me, about what you're trying to address. Has there been a consideration of how gender impacts this process that you seek to deliver? Honestly, I know it's in development. I'm putting on the spot a bit here.
To date, look, a lot of the things when we go out to community, we do try and get equal representation. There is another piece to alongside of this one, which is in that the denominational space as well, and ensuring in those areas is quite important too. So I believe that there is, but I couldn't hand on heart say that we're always going for equal representation.
Yeah. And if we look at it from the point of view of what Lula was talking about, which was the strategic transformational piece, there is perhaps opportunities now to kind of think about, well, do we understand, as you said, through the consultation, the need from all genders and an intersectional perspective, but, can we recognise that in some of the language that we're using? And you've already talked to the blind spots and perhaps in the information gathering. So that's stage one, is just absolutely seeking to understand, well, hang on, do we understand what we're trying to achieve here? Because once we understand that, you can go on to stage two, which is that context. And this is really where the opportunity is for you to learn. I encourage you to see a GIA as a learning process. Be curious. Now, some of you might be now thinking about some of the policies you've got. Again, Chris and Andrew, when you're thinking about the enormous infrastructure that you're doing, I encourage you to think about this applying not to the whole memorial park, but just to parts of the process to deliver that outcome. So how does gender shape the context of the process, the policy of the program being reviewed? So for Leah or for Julie, for your complaints process, how does gender impact it? You might not have thought about it. Do you know how the different genders like to actually put feedback into the organisation? What are some of the gender norms around raising complaints? What evidence do you already have? So, you might look back and see, well, who's put the complaints in? Is there a need to get a more intersectional gender view on that data that you already have? What more do you need to find out? Do you know who's going to be affected and what difference they are for those people and lives? And what lived experience of diverse people can you learn from? So Leah, can we go and talk out to the LGBTIQ plus community, knowing that that acronym actually represents not one group of people, but many different lived experiences? When it comes to grief of men, and grief of men of their children passing or their siblings, how do we support that? Do we understand the memorialisation hopes of different genders as opposed to different faith groups, and what that means? Have we actually got a sense of women who their partners have passed, are perhaps left with less disposable income to spend on memorialisation? Have we actually got those partnerships in place? So this is why we encourage you to start small with the GIA at a pilot stage. Noting time, I'm just going to skip through this and go on to the next one. While you've got that all in place, this is where you start to see what options are available to you. So Vita, if we go back to your process of naming, when you were developing that, you identified a problem that you wanted that process to fix. What options did you think were available to you at the time, if I can ask you to go back?
That's not a process that I've actually developed. It's something that I'm reviewing at the moment.
Oh, okay. Options coming to you.
But part of the development and the ongoing development of this particular piece is around how do we ensure that the organisation trips off this process at an appropriate time to ensure that consultation can be undertaken, that we've reviewed the information that's available to us already, and that we've got time to go back to community, for example, if the name that they've suggested for us is not appropriate, all of those kind of elements. So it's the triggers, and it's as an organisation what we agree to and what is appropriate for naming as we go forward.
And I wonder too, is there one of the pieces of work that we're very familiar at WHISE at the moment is of the public naming of places and how it's predominantly, particularly in arts and civic people. We know that there's a push on to, there's a campaign, a grassroots campaign, particularly around the Mornington Peninsula area, I have to say, around getting more streets and places named after women. That's come because of, if I could say, the naming processes, the consultation process and who made the decisions. They've found the process for naming had a bias in it, an implicit bias, I have to say. I guess some of the options available to us is to make sure that our process opens up those decision-making places, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the options there are, well, what options are we for actually creating that transformational change? This stage actually asks you to create a number of options and take the time. Again, it's providing you with the deliberate opportunity to take the time to think about each option. So Andrew and Chris, I know one of the things you were thinking about was suppliers. You know, you might think about, well, we want to go to suppliers that actually apply a gender lens in their architecture and their landscape design. And I wonder if one of the risks that you will discover through that process is there's not many that does, like Michelle identified before. So what are the options for you if that's one of the risks moving forward? Is it that you ask them to go on a journey with you to discover it? There's lots of different options available to you. Chris, I've just seen you go and Andrew go off mute. Did you want to make a comment at that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that quite often our options are directly proportionate to the size and scale and complexity of the organisations that we partner with. So, you know, if you go to typically consulting professional firms, they're very much in tune with that because design follows trend and follows movement and follows how things evolve. So I think there's a very high awareness when you're in the professional, the consulting space. What will be interesting for us in terms of how do we apply gender lens to a number of things, including our delivery models, will be more to do with the size and scale. So we tend to play with very small, boutique, even mum and dad type operations.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting, Kit, I think, is how do we actually apply the right pathway with, based on the criteria or the attributes of the partner that we're trying to work with. So I think one aspect, large scale architectural design firms, it will be a very easy conversation to say we want to understand how you're applying the gender equality to the decision-making process in design, as well as at an organisation level. When you get to very small operators, applying the same type of consideration becomes a little bit limited. So one becomes a journey piece. One becomes how might we encourage you to go beyond opportunities for apprentices, which is what we tend to get in our assessment criteria of new partners, into something a bit more. So I think there's going to be opportunity to try and lift and shift some of our partners, and then others are going to be a little bit easier to get some traction with. So,
Chris, I don't know if you had anything to say to that as well.
Well, I guess the other thing that sort of will underpin that a bit is, given the scale of projects we're dealing with, or especially the one I am, we're under state government procurement rules. So there'll be an element of whatever state government policy is that gets pulled through into the project, and mandated through as well.
Yeah.
I'm not across how this legislation sort of sits in that package, but I know that, in my 10 years dealing with government procurement, there's been sort of an evolution of requirements around diversity and inclusiveness in procurement.
Yeah. I think your radar, Chris, around, I think there was an announcement a couple of days ago about how the state government through the Treasurer are going to modify some of their procurement of government to encourage construction organisations to recruit women. That's certainly one way that procurement can be used. If I can take you to another sector that's also struggling with this, it's local councils. So they deal with a lot of small contractors, cleaning companies, all sorts of different small organisations. If we think of those questions about, we can define the gendered benefits and costs for the organisation and the impact of the option. But when we look at unintended consequences, things like that, one way that this industry has overcome that is they're seeing themselves as deliberately building capability in partnership with the sector, right? So for local councils, so for instance, one of those might be the City of Casey, they are working with the large developers to help them develop the sector. They are working with other councils to try to work out how to address this. Right? Now, as Lula said before, you're engaged in social change. This takes time. And I can tell you now that Dr. Nikki Vincent, the Commissioner, is interested in how you're going to do that. This is not a quick turnaround. So this is the spot where you can think that through in a full business case. Costs, benefits, we take the time to go through that at this point. The final point is you actually make the recommendation for change. What's the evidence you've collected? What's the risks, the mitigations, and how the recommendation meets the needs? So again, sorry, Vita, go.
With those recommendations, that's the kind of area that we could actually include some of the questions that we're asking more broadly here. For this particular project, we've recommended we take the following steps as part of like a springboard into, reviewing this more broadly as an organisation. That might be the way that we're moving it forward. As you say, if this is a huge social change or a transformational piece, we're not going to be able to do it within the scope of one project. But that might be the springboard for us. Andrew and Chris, would that kind of work to support where your heads might be at with some of the supplier pieces? I know that Michelle was raising this too. So it's like the recommendation for, the next event is that we start exploring where we might be able to get some of this information from more suppliers with a view to longer term introducing a policy which asks us to always have, these recommendations or these kind of criteria met by our suppliers. When we're looking at working with community, for example, and those areas that we know that there is going to be unequal representation, it's definitely a male-dominated cultural or religious background. Going out to those communities might be quite detrimental to the relationship and rapport that we're building with them, to just go, okay, so what are you doing for gender equity? What's happening for women? How are you working with LGBTIQA plus community? And they're going to be very unhappy about that in the first instance. However, if we say, look, we're starting this conversation, this is the recommendation for our initial engagement, with a view to working with local government and other stakeholders within this community to see how we might address this long term, but it's not going to solve the issues for that particular project. Would that be correct as an assumption there, Kit? I just want to get that straight in my head.
Yeah.
So we're not taking on the world with each project as we go through as part of the pilot. Absolutely.
You start with what's the problem, right? You start with what's the problem. And the reason you start with that, as I said, which is not the whole Memorial Park development. So for the naming, it's we want to make sure we're getting equitable, intersectional, gender equitable lens applied to our naming, that we're reflecting community. That's the problem. So then the next thing, what's the evidence around that? What's the policy context? This is the mission of SMSED. This is what we know about our community. This is the data of our community, the diversity that we serve. And you're amongst the most diverse community in Australia. Then what's the gaps that we've identified for that? All right, what's the options, the evidence, the cost, the risks, and the recommendation? And as you get better at that, as you get your eye in, as it's called, you'll actually find that the challenges that you're about to address increase. As Lula says, it is going to be done in increments, looking where the opportunity lies in each project and each decision. And can I go back to the strengths you've already got, right? You started this conversation by telling us that you already think about, Dean talked about it, already think about community experience and customer experience. You've already got that skill set. We're asking you to hone it. And I'm hoping that that's the 4 steps, folks. And I'm hoping that what you can see is that by going through it very deliberately, and like everything, learning takes time, it gives you the opportunity to think through it quite deliberately in increments. Now, the really good news is the Commission has actually created a kit to do it. And I know we'll be taking a break soon and going through and studying our action learning group, but you can see in this kit that it actually has got the template to fill in. Sorry, I'll just go down, and I've already taken from this. So they've actually got template tools of how to go through and actually answer the questions. And they're all available on the website. So this is the first one about how you go and understand the challenges. Now, this is a template. It's not going to be right for everyone or every organisation, but it just gets you to step through to answer the question. We actually think that the biggest challenge that any organisation faces when doing this work is getting it business as usual. Now, I know Malcolm had to drop out, but he's already asking those questions, and this is recorded so he can see that too. But here's the thing that you need to discover. How does your current delegation of authority policy empower your people to do this? Who has the authority to do a GIA? Who has the authority to make the recommendation? And who approves the enactment of that recommendation? What skill and capacity is required to do this? Now, I'm lucky because I work with someone called Lula Dembele, who's got qualifications in gender mainstreaming and has done this lots of different places, all right? But do we have the right skills and expertise within the organisation? Do we have the right, can I tell you, partnerships? So you've got a women's health service in the region who Lula said you can partner with, right? Now, in partner language, that means a partnership, not fee for service. Can I just say the thing? So, but we're on a common goal for change. Can you partner with other organisations and suppliers to help develop it? Can you start conversations with other entities? But have we got the right skills of the people in the group to actually create the change? What existing planning structures do you have? I know that SMCT has a planning structure. And how have you got your existing evaluation and monitoring that your policies and programs are regularly reviewed with a gender lens? Andrew, you've come off mute. I didn't know if you wanted to say something.
No, it was further to what Vita was saying previously about yeah, how we might go about applying some of these lenses. I think one of the things that's probably going to come, which is front of mind for us, is about how this starts to apply to procurement policy, particularly about the selections that we make through that policy. And I think one of the things that we're really going to have to contemplate is how do we objectively define what's good, bad, or indifferent? Because in a traditional government framework of procurement that we sit within, it tends to be weighted in, there are lots of criteria, they're weighted in a particular way. And it's, for us, I think it's really understanding what is the weighting of the objectiveness of some of those criteria, because we might end up with a whole bunch of suppliers and vendors who score next to nothing, and potentially will lose their competitive advantage because we don't actually have a proper well-informed and objective criteria on which to base them. So they might be emerging, but if we have a criteria that isn't well-informed, that actually might work against them. So it's that balance between equality and competitive in the marketplace, in the way that we assess and select our vendors, and how do we make sure that they're showing the right evidence, or they're making the right positive steps to meet that criteria. So we go back to the small trader, the dog in a ute trader, might be doing things with all the best intentions and making positive steps, but if you compare them to a tier 1 civil works contractor, I guess I'm just trying to, I guess we need to call out, understanding that criteria is going to be really important for us.
And maybe that's the problem that you want to challenge, right? How do we create consistent gender equity practice across the diversity of our traders? The answer to that might be we can't. So then the challenge is, can we target the small suppliers to develop their capacity? That might be the review to the policy that you've got in place. And then the solutions to that might be bringing in the big guns. Right?
It could be recognising the fact that they're committed to change. The fact that they might drive it through their training and education approach. They might, there's probably lots of ways that they could do it that are starting to show signs that they're committed to change. And I think we need to recognise that just as much as established systems.
Yep. And I think there's, as I was thinking about incrementally, it might be for one project, you find a female supplier who's able to do the exact same thing, and you've just taken that step to find that singular one, and so you can't replace everybody. It's not about replacement, but it's not necessarily going to be in a gender segregated workforce or sector that you can just go, all right, everyone's gender balanced now and we're sorted this out and the whole thing's got to be that way. But it's that incremental step. Okay, for this project, we managed to find this supplier that's a female-led organisation and we're using them this time for this thing. And so it's not going to be necessarily everything, but you've taken a deliberate step, and that's the process as well. So additional then that conversation of lifting and building the capacity and the work, but I think you'll find that there are options that you can bring in small ways for each decision, each project, that starts to build out and step you towards that general step of improvement. So you're not nth degree every time, but you are taking one step, and then you build on that, and then you learn from that process. And then as you'll see, supply and demand works, right? So if you're saying that these are our needs, I think that'll start to shape the sector as well in ways that you may not see for a while, but that will start to have that ripple effect as the pebble.
Yep. I think in the rush for perfection, excellence is fine. And this is a deliberate project for a learning journey. We've got a bit of a check-in. I know we've got less people now that we did at the start, and I want to apologise for running considerably over time, but I think the discussion was really valuable and important to have. If you just let us know, I think we've got all the feedback there. The only other thing that is really important for us to know now is just what else do you want to know now? So what we've done in Learning Land is we've turned on your reticular activating system. So now you're probably starting to notice. It's not uncommon for people to come out of these sessions and notice everything's inequitable, right? And that can become a bit overwhelming. Let us know what you want to do. We're going to take a break in a second and come back and start our action learning teams to try to start to get into the process. But let us know what other things you're wanting to know. The action learning process will start off by just working out is this something we want to work on, and what's the problem? So we just start with the first step. We don't have to do the whole bit in the next hour. Absolutely, the templates will absolutely be shared. And as I said, they are all available on this website here. No state secrets, that's where they all are. And that'll be a core document for us. And the Action Learning Group, we're going to have a shared Google Drive or a shared drive where we can share things and keep things as well. Absolutely, you will have a copy of the slide deck. I will send that through to you for sure. So what steps do we need to take? Yep, we're going to go through that. So we'll go through the 4 steps. That'll be the steps that we break for. And how far do we need to go with consultation, and who will do it at SMCT? It depends upon your area, and it'll depend upon the solutions that you need to find to address the challenge. You might have the systems that you might have might be fine. They just need a bit of tweaking. But for some of you actually might discover, we've got a whole section of the community we're not talking to enough. Approaches with working with faith-based community might be absolutely, and is always something we need to learn, and it might be Vita that I can share some evidence that we've got with you through to your colleagues, and happy to kind of organise a forum or a specific thing for engaging on that too, Vita.
I think that'll be a terrific one, particularly for the outreach framework that's being developed, and to strengthen and bolster the strategic engagement framework that we've been putting together. A lot of the work that we'll be doing here through the GIA will support both of those pieces for us as a consultation team within strategic engagement, and also to support anybody else who's undertaking this consultation. So they'll have some ready tools at their disposal, which of course we'll have to keep coming back and refining as we go forward.
Yeah. So